Some legends are told, some turn to dust or to gold, but you will remember me for centuries.
This is the Cameron Parker Show, brought to you by Spreaker, where we discuss everything from around the local professional sports scene in Colorado, such as the Denver Broncos.
Chris Harris comes out. I don't know if he was on the drive, but he said, I knew 15 seconds into that game that I should have been on T.Y. Hilton. If players are coming out and saying that, it falls again on the coaching staff.
Not to mention insiders from around your local sports scene. Ryan Spilborgs, former outfielder for your Colorado Rockies.
It's not going to be the 25 guys that leave spring training that are going to be the only guys the entire season. I mean, you need depth. You need guys that are going to be in your minor leagues that you may not expect.
Ryan Edwards.
You know, when you're talking about an offensive line, it's about the five best guys, right? And you're talking about the five best guys gelling. There hasn't been a lot of time for that.
It's showtime. Are you ready? Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. It is another episode of the Cameron Parker Show podcast, and I am pleased to be joined by the HuddleUp podcast draft analyst, host, NFL draft guru, Iowa Hawkeyes fan, Nick Kendell. How you doing, my man?
Well, I am glad to be joining you under these circumstances after the Heroes Trophy game, how it played out today, and ready for a good game of college football tomorrow and Paxton Lynch. So there's a lot of exciting stuff going on. Stomach's still very full. Those leftovers are still digesting from Thanksgiving, and glad to be on.
Well, it's great to have you. Obviously, you won the Heroes game between Nebraska and Iowa, and it's going to be a different Cameron Parker show today because, well, I am a Nebraska Cornhuskers fan. You're an Iowa Hawkeyes fan, but this is going to be the first time that we actually talk about breaking down a college football game, and what better way to do it than seeing it from the point of view that you saw, being an Iowa perspective, and from the Nebraska perspective, in which a season that, well, has been incredibly disappointing, to put it honestly, and as far as what we had last year with Tommy Armstrong. And maybe we just jump right into it there as far as the Nebraska Cornhuskers game, because it just happened. It had just finished, about 5:30. What were some of your takeaways as far as the Iowa game? Because Iowa, to me, feels like, as far as a team that both Wisconsin, Nebraska, at least on the outside looking in, Nebraska, Iowa, and Wisconsin will always be vying to try and play in the Big Ten championship game, at least on the outside, at least what it has been in historically. So it's been a little bit of a down year, though, also for Iowa. So what potentially for you were some of the keys that could potentially be build-offs to next season?
Well, Iowa is a very young team, specifically offensively. They're playing true sophomore quarterback, pretty unheralded quarterback, but very much a pro style. Probably will be talked about decently high next year in the draft if he can take another step forward. But Nate Stanley, only a sophomore. They were playing two freshman tackles this year, which this is the first time in the Kirk Ferentz era, which has been 19 years, I believe now. The first time that he's had a freshman offensive tackle, and he has two of them this season, a redshirt and a true freshman, and also two sophomore tight ends that they love to get involved. So this season was pretty up and down offensively. I mean, we had a lot of road games where we struggled to move the football, run the football. The last 2 weeks especially, they only scored 13 offensive points in the last 2 weeks. But then you have the games on the outside of that. You got Nebraska, where Iowa puts up 56 points on the road, and the game against Ohio State, where they also put up 50 points. So it's very much a boom or bust offense, but this is the first year with Brian Ferentz as the offensive coordinator. He's the son of the head coach, Kirk Ferentz, and has also had some NFL experience. He worked actually with the New England Patriots for a few years, and farthest along he got there was the tight end coach for them, and he was the tight end coach for some of those really good Patriots offenses for the tight ends, where they had Gronkowski and Aaron Hernandez. So I'm really excited to see what he can do with the offense going forward into next year. Not having a quarterback competition will be huge because you get Stanley those reps to get more time, and we have have some really young. Most of the receivers will be back. I think the only big guys that we're losing next year on offense are we lose Matt Vandenberg, who's kind of, he's not going to play at the next level. He's more of a slot guy, but because Nick Easley, the junior transfer, plays slot for Iowa, Vandenberg moved to the outside. Nick Easley's a better slot, better wide receiver. And then they're going to lose Akram Wadley, who absolutely had a fantastic game today. Probably his second best game of the season. 19 carries, 159 yards, 8.4 yards per carry, and 3 touchdowns. So
Yeah.
when Iowa can run the football, Iowa football is beautiful. When teams take away Iowa's run, it is ugly. So glad to have Wadley have a good game before the bowl season starts here to get him up there. I think he broke the 1,000 yards because of today's big game. If not, he was really close. But, Iowa's a pretty good young team, especially offensively. So I'm excited to see what they'll be next year. And they have a very easy schedule next year as well.
Yeah, and, with especially some of their playmakers, I feel like for Iowa's sake, they have really very underrated players offensively. With Akram Wadley, he doesn't get very much notoriety as far as potentially being looked at the next level. But I mean by the sake of people that are, I guess, heralded draft experts that really don't maybe look too much into it. But as far as the Iowa-Nebraska game, who could potentially be draft potential necessarily in a game like this? Because for Nebraska's sake, well, if there's certainly some talent there on the offensive side, and really nothing to say for it except for on the defensive side, except for maybe one player, which would be Chris Jones, maybe the cornerback at Nebraska. But offensively, Stanley Morgan's come along really well the last few weeks. Now breaking the 40-plus year barrier as far as Johnny Rodgers is concerned, which is pretty crazy to think about, that no receiver has ever had 1,000 yards at the University of Nebraska. Going back to the triple option days and all of that. But as far as the draft prospects in this game, as far as Iowa and Nebraska, what potentially could be there? Obviously the defensive side of the ball with Josie Jewell, and obviously Josh Jackson potentially in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. You hit the guys nail on the head with the guys that Iowa has. Akram Wadley, probably 3rd or 4th round pick. He very explosive. You saw it today when he can get those cuts. He kind of looks like a mini LaShawn McCoy out there, not Marshawn McCoy. And
You never know.
Yeah, no, good player. He's not the biggest. He's under 200 pounds, so that's kind of going to hold him back a little bit. And Iowa, because of the offense they play, they didn't really show him much playing in the slot, playing that receiver role, which I think he will need to do at the next level to succeed. So hopefully we'll see him getting a chance to do that in a couple postseason bowls and whatnot. I'm a big fan of Jackson. I've talked to a few scouts, actually, that have him in the 1st round. So Iowa potentially has a 1st-round cornerback there. He almost had that 8th interception today that would have given him the lead for the most interceptions in college football, but dropped that one. That was a good job by the Nebraska receiver to break it up. They do have some interior offensive linemen that are pretty highly heralded. Probably not going to be starters at the next level of the NFL, but some guys that'll be drafted. They have Welsh, who's a right guard for Iowa, been pretty steady there. Some people talked about him being one of the better senior interior offensive linemen coming into this season. Probably more of a backup kind of interior offensive lineman at the next level, but a talented guy. They also had a right tackle who tore his Achilles in week 2, Ike Boddicker, who many people think could be drafted 4th, 5th round if he can show out healthy at the end there. And but other than that, Iowa's a pretty young team. They got a bunch of linebackers. You mentioned Josie Jewell, who a shame that he wasn't put up to the postseason award list that he should have been put on. But what can you do? So they can't get everybody right every year.
Right.
And also, there's a good linebacker that Iowa has as a senior as well. All 3 Iowa's linebackers are seniors this season, but they have one whose name is Ben Neiman, who again, probably not a very high draft pick if drafted at all, but I think he's going to stick on a roster of special teams. They play a lot of 4-3 cover 2 base, where it's it's very much guys playing in their zone, squatting back, bend don't break type of defense. Works great for college. Not the best for the NFL when you got playmakers, but in college, if you can keep everything in front of you, especially if you're not crazy good like a team like Alabama or whatever going against Iowa, or Iowa a few years ago against Christian McCaffrey when he just absolutely destroyed him. It works pretty well. So Ben Neiman's a guy who plays out there. more of that cover linebacker. So I think he's a guy who potentially could be drafted and find a spot on an NFL roster. I mean, the Iowa Hawkeyes have quietly put in some linebackers in the NFL. You got Hitchens, who's been playing pretty solidly for the Cowboys over these past few years, and Christian Kirksey, who's been a good linebacker for the Browns. Obviously, Chad Greenway was there for a while, and just a bunch of those guys. So I think Neiman's got the potential to be one of those next unheralded guys who gets drafted and gets a chance to make some noise in the NFL.
What about on the Nebraska side of things? I'm getting there as far as the draft analysis, but obviously there's still ways to go. But as far as the Nebraska side of things, because that really, and it has been kind of sad, and maybe the Nebraska fan in me feels that way, but it is a little bit sad to see the talent, the NFL talent necessarily, really nosedive from Nebraska side of things, because you were looking at the likes of maybe in the 90s of players that could potentially translate, and even back into the Irving Fryer days. Irving Fryer was drafted, I believe it was in the first round. I think he was the number 1 overall pick, I believe, by the Philadelphia Eagles. But there really hasn't been a constant NFL, playmaker. I mean, really, you look at the last maybe 5-6 years from Nebraska, the best player really to ever come out in that time span was probably Amir Abdullah. So, from Nebraska's side of things, as far as the draft expert and draft analyst, Nick, where do you see as far as some players?
Looking at this roster, I don't see a lot of NFL talent, to be completely honest. I was pretty impressed with Stanley Morgan Jr. today. But, I mean, Iowa does not have the best secondary besides Josh Jackson. I mean, I don't know if you saw the Iowa-Purdue game last week, but the rest of those guys just got burnt, and especially in that third quarter where it got out of hand today. But I did see some stuff that I liked from Stanley Morgan Jr. Tanner Lee's a guy who has some arm talent. You can see him out there. I just don't think Nebraska had a great offensive line this season. They didn't run the football very effectively, and Tanner Lee's a little bit erratic, but he's a redshirt transfer junior, and I think he has a chance to potentially put some tape on next season to improve, especially potentially with a little bit easier schedule in another year in the system. Although if you're firing your coach, could be a completely different scheme next year, so we'll see about that. And you mentioned Chris Jones as well. Chris Jones has shown some stuff. I don't think this is a pretty actually decent cornerback class, at least it's looking to be, but Chris Jones is a guy who has the size. I mean, 6 foot, 200 pounds, 6'1", 205 pounds, that kind of range. Moves pretty well, and worst case scenario, he's a back end day 3 kind of guy and going to get a chance to play special teams mainly the year 1, and if he can show out of that, earn more and more. But looking over this roster, I don't think there's many guys on here that look like, wow, that guy's going to be an NFL player.
Right.
Which that's a sad state for what Nebraska has been and what they've been. I mean, they've been pretty much a disappointment since they joined the Big Ten.
They really have been. The days of Bo Pelini, and really the only reason why they don't have Bo Pelini is because of the personality that he was, and as far as him not hitting it off well with the management, the athletic department and everything like that. So that's really the reason why Bo Pelini is not here. Because looking at it, Bo Pelini was about 9 wins, 10 wins every single year. So if he certainly had the rapport that he should have had with the athletic department, he would have been here. And obviously Nebraska was looking for a new head coach, which leads to the coaching carousel discussion. Boy, it's very, very crazy so far in the college football season. You're starting to get the rumors out there that maybe Chip Kelly is, well, to begin, there was rumors at the very beginning that he was leaning towards Florida. Well, now you get the rumors that some coaches are starting to feel that he's leaning towards UCLA, and now you're starting to get rumors again from the same guy that put out the report that Scott Frost is close to a deal with Nebraska, that same guy is still saying that it appears to be not just a close deal, but a done deal for that sake. And so even for Tennessee's sake, there could potentially be a lot of head coaching candidates despite Florida. Let's just say for the sake that they miss out on Scott Frost, there are still some decent coaching candidates out there if they just so choose to go that route. But it's crazy.
Yeah, there seems to be a decent amount of coaching vacancies that are going to be happening here pretty soon. I mean, we saw today Brett Bielema was fired just, a couple hours ago with
Bonkers,
Arkansas.
how that went down.
Yeah, that's he coached pretty well at Wisconsin, but the SEC is kind of a different beast, so that's definitely a big one. Tennessee's obviously a big job. UCLA, a decent job there. Florida, I mean, that's a great gig. There's been talks that Texas A&M might open up as well, so it's definitely going to be interesting, and there's a lot of guys to consider for those programs.
If you're Chip Kelly, where do you go? I mean, if you're Chip Kelly and you're looking at Florida and UCLA, where do you go?
I think I'm going to Florida. That SEC East is not very great right now. Who in the SEC East besides Georgia scares you? I think Kentucky might be the second best team in the SEC East. That's how far a lot of those teams have fallen in the recent years. And the SEC East is not used to that Chip Kelly offense. He has a better recruiting pool. I think, he doesn't have as many challenges with USC and some of those Pac-12. I think you have a pretty easy path to the SEC championship to get clobbered by Alabama whenever you have to go against them. But I think Florida's probably the way to go.
Do you buy the whole Chip Kelly to UCLA rumors?
I think it's definitely leverage, and I bet UCLA would be interested. That seems about the Hollywood market, but after going with Jim Mora, who had some issues there, I could see UCLA probably going with a younger face, not somebody who's had as much experience, kind of just a culture-building kind of guy to bring in. So I could see it, especially, you have a conference that he's familiar with, but I think Florida, in the end, probably makes the most sense for him.
Well, and so then that kind of leads me to the Scott Frost point, because you mentioned it. Why not UCLA looking at a guy like Scott Frost?
I could definitely see that happening, but I feel like if Scott Frost has a chance to go back home to Nebraska, where he played quarterback, was a great quarterback for them for a number of years, probably one of the top 5 or 10 quarterbacks that Nebraska's had, I feel like it's just a match made in heaven. And you got a bunch of really fun young coaches in the Big Ten West right now. So I think he could probably join that fold. You got Braum for Purdue, who they're putting up a brand new facility. It's going to be one of the better ones in the Big Ten, and they're a program that looks pretty young and exciting growing up there. You got Fleck at Minnesota. You got a good. Obviously Wisconsin's playing great football right now, and Kirk Ferentz is the old guy there. But I could see him. If I was him, I would go to Nebraska, look to compete, and throw my hat in that ring of all those good young talented coaches right now, because behind Wisconsin, there's room to be had to take over that second place in the Big Ten West.
Yeah, and you mentioned how weak the SEC East is. Well, that Big Ten division with Iowa and Wisconsin is really to be had by anyone. And obviously Wisconsin is going to be that mainstay, and and it's one of the reasons why this is kind of an under the radar point about the Big Ten, but it's one of the under the radar points that I think that if I'm Josh Allen, and you're hearing rumors that he might be a grad transfer and Michigan's being thrown around as a possible landing spot, I would even, if I'm Josh Allen, I would look at Wisconsin, because the play of Scott Hornibrook could potentially cost them a chance at winning a national championship. And so if I'm Josh Allen and I'm looking to write the narrative of trying to play against better competition, I would potentially go to a team like Wisconsin, because if you go to a team like that, you're going to play against, much decent competition as far as the Big Ten is concerned, because you get teams like a Minnesota and a Northwestern that are very underrated and underappreciated, and especially maybe a new Indiana team that's starting to come up a little bit in the last few years. And then even with Scott Frost, you go back to the Scott Frost dynamic, maybe even a Nebraska could even float into that as far as being a young coach. He can work with you. And potentially he's one of the more budding coaches overall, in just the NCAA landscape. And so let's just say that Scott Frost does go to Nebraska, which is kind of that Urban Meyer dynamic, of seeing the success that Urban Meyer had at the University of Ohio State. He was also an alumni there. I think that's also not just a big draw for playing for your alma mater, but just seeing the type of success that he's had at Ohio State. I think that it would be a draw for Scott Frost, and potentially maybe kind of perk the ears up a little bit for a Josh Allen.
Yeah, I could see that. The thing with Wisconsin that I think would be maybe an issue with him is that Wisconsin is not going to ask him to make many NFL throws. You know, how many times they're winning games because their offensive system with the running game and how much they play off that play action. They don't have to have Hornibrook make NFL throws. I mean, obviously Josh Allen would make that program that much better. They could call that much more. But I feel like you don't have the pedigree that you'd have with Jim Harbaugh running that more of a pro-style scheme, definitely more pro-style passing concepts. But I definitely could see him doing that. From what I've heard recently, though, it sounds like Josh Allen is leaning towards coming out this season. There was some talk about grad transfer, but recent talk sounds like he's going to graduate on time and maybe even is going to be in mobile for the Senior Bowl. So definitely interesting to follow that going forward. A name I want to toss out there for the Tennessee job, though, I'd love to see Matt Campbell go there because I'd love to see a great coach leave Iowa State. But I hear that he has a buyout that's pretty significant. So the name that I think makes the most sense is the pretty successful head coach recently in the area, Mike Norvell for Memphis. Memphis has been playing great football. I think they're 8-1, 9-1 right now. They're moving the football great, and he's used to recruiting that Tennessee landscape. So Mike Norvell, I think, is a great candidate for that Tennessee job. He might not be the splashiest hire, but he's definitely a guy I could see them building that program back up and making it about Tennessee football again.
You know, coming from the time of where Nebraska was in the Big 12, it is sad, obviously, just on the outskirts of being a fan and seeing Iowa State play well. But also, I think I'm very pleased to see how far and how quick Iowa State has come along as a program, and seeing Matt Campbell being thrown around as potential coaching candidate at various programs. I think it's a great move. And potentially for Tennessee, you have to get younger. And the best way to get that is potentially going after guys like Scott Frost, if you want. You know, they're rumored to be attached to him as well. So I think that for Tennessee, a guy like Matt Campbell does sound maybe the best match potentially, but you know, really you don't know as far as how much homework they do and looking at certain schools, and maybe they do look at a Memphis job, the guy from Memphis, and potentially because he's right down the road, and so you just never know. Let's move into the college football playoff. The college football playoff took a significant hit today, and speaking of Wisconsin, well, it looks like they have knocked themselves on the door potentially of being in the college football playoff discussion, and that was, well, simply because Miami lost to Pittsburgh.
Yeah, what a crazy, ugly game, but that's college football.
Yeah.
That makes that ACC championship game that much more exciting because, I mean, you have two great programs, a lot of defensive talent especially, man. Their defensive talent is incredible. Those guys fly to the football. A lot of future NFL players playing in that game. And you have Clemson losing a fluky game, traveling, I think it was a Thursday night game too, at Syracuse. Then you have this game right after Thanksgiving, early Friday morning for Miami just not showing up in Pittsburgh. So I think the winner of that game probably should still get in. But this Iron Bowl, I think, is going to have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, and especially with Miami. You know, when you look at Miami, you know, obviously Mark Richt has turned that program around as quick as a hiccup, basically to what it was at the Georgia heydays, or the Georgia glory days, I should say. And is it possible that one loss by a Miami team is still good enough to be in the college football playoff discussion?
Oh, I say so, especially if they beat Clemson. I mean, that almost feels like a play-in game. They have a lot of talent. Miami doesn't get enough credit for how much talent they have because it seems like a lot of their talent isn't draft eligible. So you have these young guys who are all sophomores that probably first-round picks next season, but because they're not draft eligible, people aren't talking about them as much. But I love Amon Richards, their wide receiver, number 82, about as much as any sophomore wide receiver in college football. I think he could be top half of the first round next season. They got a young defensive end, another sophomore, Joseph Jackson, number 99. Looks like a top half first round talent as well. He absolutely just destroyed Mike McGlinchey in that Miami Notre Dame game. And then I think this off-ball linebacker group for Miami is about as good as any in the country. They all played last season too as freshmen, and this season they just are flying around, making plays on the football, that's what Miami's brand is: athletic, quick, turnover-producing defense and smash mouth, throw the football down the field offense, and that's what they're doing. I think Clemson should be favored in that game, but if Miami beats Clemson, who's also obviously a great team and only has one loss in the season, a fluky one to Pittsburgh, I don't see how you leave them out. It would be really hard to leave them out.
Right. It's kind of like even the Ohio State discussion, because let's just say they beat Wisconsin. How do you write off the fact of wanting to put Ohio State now back into the college football playoff discussion because they beat Wisconsin, which is not out of the realm of possibility. I mean, and I mentioned it before as far as referring to the Josh Allen and Wisconsin part of it, but really their quarterback, talking about Scott Hornibrook, is the only issue for Wisconsin. Their defense is legit. It flies around the football, maybe the best defense in the country. And then you look at the offensive side of the ball. It's offensive line university for Wisconsin, maybe even running back university, depending on the amount of running backs they put out. They have a stud freshman that has entered the Heisman conversation and is more than likely not going to win it. However, the amount of production that he has put forth this season has been insane. And whether that's due to the offensive line of Wisconsin or just himself, I guess it can go both ways on that one. But really, the reason why I think Ohio State would have the opportunity with Wisconsin is just simply because better quarterback play.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, it's hard to forget about the last time that Ohio State and Wisconsin met in the Big Ten Championship. Ohio State beat them 59-0. That was that beginning of that magical Cardale Jones, Ezekiel Elliott run. But I don't know. That game's definitely a toss-up right now. I mean, Ohio State definitely has more blue-chip talent across that defensive front. But if Wisconsin can run the football effectively and control the flow of the game, and Hornibrook doesn't throw some stupid interceptions, Wisconsin could win that game. I mean, Hornibrook seems like he's prone to one or two dumb picks a game. But, I mean, he has some great throws as well, especially in the red zone. He can convert in the red zone. They have a great turnover-producing defense. I love the way they use that 3-4. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Kind of a counterpoint to what Iowa runs, because Iowa runs that kind of bland 4-3 bend don't break, and then you have Wisconsin running that 3-4 where they're very aggressive, sending different pressure, a lot of unblocked men getting to the quarterback, a lot of good talent in the linebacking core. So a lot of fun. I think if Wisconsin wins, they're in.
Oh,
and if
yeah,
Oklahoma
absolutely.
Wins, they're in. So it's really going to come down to, I think this Iron Bowl could be big. If Auburn is able to beat Alabama, that throws an entire wrench in this process, and somebody's going to get left out.
Yeah, I think you're going to see the College Football Playoff Committee maybe throw up their arms like, I don't know who you want to throw in there now, because of the fact that there's just so much change necessarily that could happen with those top 4, top 5 teams. And I think that there's just, as far as the games that are going to go on, you think potentially the toss-ups we talked about at Miami and Clemson, and then Wisconsin and Ohio State, and then you go into first they have to take care of business against Michigan, which is always a tough game. So for Ohio State's sake, they're still not out of the question of maybe even being in that college football playoff discussion, because they have a massive rivalry tomorrow against maybe the biggest rivalry in college football, and that is Michigan. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that even Ohio State seals its fate of being in or out against Michigan.
Yeah, absolutely. But I feel like things have to fall their way. Because you have Oklahoma State. I think they're going to end up playing TCU in the Big 12 championship. Oklahoma. If Oklahoma wins, they got to be in, right? They beat Ohio State.
Yeah.
Their only loss is Iowa State. So there's one team. You got Alabama. I think as long as Alabama wins one of their next 2 games, they got to be in. They already clinched the SEC West. And if they lose to Auburn, who's a darn good team, then they play Georgia. If Alabama loses both these next 2 games, they're out. But is that going to happen? No.
No
way. So you got 2 teams there, Oklahoma, Alabama. If Wisconsin wins, they got to be in. They got to beat Minnesota tomorrow, but they should smash Minnesota. We'll see what happens with Ohio State, but that's definitely a toss-up. You got Auburn. If Auburn beats Alabama after beating the crud out of Georgia, I mean, how can you say Auburn doesn't deserve it too? So
Right.
that's a huge toss-up. And then you got the ACC game. So there's 5-6 teams that really got a chance. But this, I'm telling you, this Iron Bowl, I'm supposed to go to a concert tomorrow for a friend. I might have to charge my phone and bring that in and have it on silent because I can't miss this Iron Bowl. So much NFL talent, and this is probably, in my opinion, the biggest game of the season so far.
Well, make sure you DVR it. Make sure you have it on record. You don't want to miss that.
Yeah. No, absolutely not. They put all the games up on YouTube, so a lot of times for my lunch break, I'll come back and analyze some tape for the NFL draft stuff with a nice little hour-long lunch break and a sandwich. So
Right.
I'll get that game eventually in, but I definitely want to watch just for being a fan of college football. That game tomorrow is going to be huge.
It's going to be massive. Let's transport now into the national football landscape and talk about, well, our Denver Broncos and covering the team. There was a change, and it was probably a change that should have happened a few weeks ago. And that change is at the quarterback position. We go back to the future and we talk about Paxton Lynch. Paxton Lynch was named starter for the Denver Broncos, and they will be facing the Oakland Raiders. And you talk about maybe the expectations of what could we see from a Paxton Lynch, because at the end of the day, he's still not labeled a bust, and that's because of the 2.5 game sample that he played. While at times it wasn't the best, it wasn't great, but really the Tampa Bay game, he played pretty well. All told, as far as being inserted into the lineup, I believe it was in the second half. They got a jump start necessarily with it. So it really, you can't really pinpoint him as far as a label of a bust. And I think that conversation obviously has such a negative connotation as far as labeling a guy that, because no one wants to be labeled a bust. You talk to any first round draft pick, they don't want to be labeled that. So what are the expectations potentially for the Broncos, and at least with Paxton Lynch? What are some of your expectations? I'm guessing they've already said today that they want to, dumb down the offense, which would lead to changing the offense a little bit, and changing it from the standpoint that, Mike McCoy's not here, so now you get Bill Musgrave in as offensive coordinator. So obviously they want to simplify the offense. I couldn't think of the word. They wanted to simplify the offense to the point that it's going to help the offense play better, but really, all told, they want to help it so that it can help Paxton Lynch. But what is your expectation for Paxton Lynch playing the Oakland Raiders this Sunday?
I expect a pretty simple playbook, probably 6 to 8 passing concepts. I think that they are going to bring in maybe some options, some Cam Newton kind of plays where that quarterback draw or something like that, maybe some reverses off of it, getting McKenzie the ball, maybe even a tight end, a little shuffle pass like we saw the Chiefs use with Travis Kelce a few times, or Wentz using Ertz. And I think I'm really excited to see some of that, just that college offense, because honestly, great, pro-style offense is a lot of fun, working very well, but with what Paxton Lynch does well, dumb it down, get some RPOs in there, some run-pass options, and you can add wrinkles off of that. You run that high-low concept where you can look for that big play, you can look for that play underneath, and if that's not there, you can take off. He has the athleticism of that. And if that's not working, you run some play-action RPO off of it, tight end slipping off to the flat on the other side, if the first two reads aren't there. So I think, just get him out there, have him comfortable. I think last year I watched the game against Atlanta, a very talented team last year, obviously went to the Super Bowl. Just too much speed for him, especially with Tyson Brilo getting baptized on the right side by Vic Beasley a couple times. And then you saw that game against Jacksonville where it looked like Kubiak and Dennison went to Paxton and they said to him, Paxton, I don't care what you do. Take care of the football. Don't lose this game. And he looked like he played timid. And it looked like he was out there playing too much, just not letting it rip. So I think with this team, what are the expectations going forward this season? Wins, losses. Obviously you want to beat the Raiders, but in the grand scheme, the wins or losses aren't really that important for the rest of the season. It's more about evaluating the talent that's on the team right now for next season, getting better, and just seeing what we have. And I think that's a golden opportunity for Paxton. He's a young quarterback, kind of a goofball, but going out there, just have fun. Dab after you get a first down, go throw the football up. If it's a pick, it's a pick. Don't worry too much about that. Learn from your mistakes and Go out there and show why you're a first-round pick. Show the big arm. Show the athleticism. Show the size. And I think Musgraves is going to do a good job showing that.
You know, you kind of touched on it because I believe that, you know, there is still that discussion as far as is he still the future of the Denver Broncos, and really it's up to Paxton to make that happen. And the only way that Paxton can make that happen, and it goes back to the 2.5 sample size, is that he has to get game action. That's the only way that we can figure out if we have something in that first round draft pick. And whether a lot has gone on during the season as far as is this little too late, well, now we've reached the point where you just gotta throw him out there. You got to see what you have in the guy. But I think that the Broncos have reached that gray area, maybe a triple gray area, to the point as, well, if Paxton Lynch is not the guy, and if he's not the guy, then, well, do you set your sights over to free agency? And you want to go target a guy like a Kirk Cousins, maybe an Eli Manning if his contract is not renewed. Do you want to go after a guy like a Drew Brees for another 1-year rental, which that also doesn't appear to be a possibility because, well, New Orleans is playing exceptionally well, and who knows if he just is going to plan on retiring with New Orleans. So, and then you go into the point of, well, should they draft a guy depending on, well, if he's bad and the Broncos lose the rest of their games, well, then you're looking at being a bona fide top 4, top 3 pick, which would guarantee you of landing, and let's just say Sam Darnold comes out. Rumor is that he's potentially staying, but that would guarantee you the fact of maybe getting a guy like a Josh Rosen potentially, or, as you put it on your Twitter handle, maybe even getting a guy at an offensive tackle position, securing that right tackle position, or securing the left tackle position and moving Garrett Bowles to right tackle. So obviously there's a lot of scenarios for the Denver Broncos at quarterback that could potentially affect the other positions on the roster.
Yeah, and it all depends on how Paxton plays down this stretch. If he plays well enough, I can see the Broncos going for a lower-tier veteran guy, maybe even a Brock Osweiler, just kind of an insurance policy. Brock, you're not going to be the starter here. Thank you for your services. You go out there, you execute the offense. You show everybody how to prepare and good presence in the locker room, but he's not a guy that you want starting. Or maybe they go out and get a 2nd or 3rd round pick. I mean, maybe a guy like Mason Rudolph falls, or I like Riley Ferguson. I know another Memphis quarterback, blah, blah, blah. But he has some tools, and he's fun, good athlete, and a good arm. And I could see him developing into a solid quarterback. But it all depends on how Paxton plays down the stretch. And I'm also very interested to see if Sam Darnold comes out. If Darnold comes out, I could see a lot of movement at the top of the draft to make Rosen and Darnold the first 2 picked. But if he doesn't come out, I think teams are going to be pretty disappointed at the top of this class. I don't see Lamar Jackson or Baker Mayfield being top 10 pick kind of guys.
Well, then let me just ask kind of that $1 million question. Who is the quarterback going to end up being next year? I mean, for me, I think it's going to end up being a free agent quarterback just because of the comfortability level with Elway. He's shown the comfortability to make it happen as far as making it work in free agency. He hasn't shown the propensity to draft well as far as a quarterback is concerned. So as far as it being this season and with it being incredibly disappointing, I think for Elway's sake, it also is a gray area for him to show that he can do what he does best, and that is go into free agency, potentially sign yourself a quarterback, maybe sign yourself an inside linebacker if you can, and then draft the right tackle. Or even, as you said, I mentioned it, move Garrett Bowles to right tackle. So maybe talk a little bit also about why you feel that Garrett Bowles should be moved to right tackle. So kind of a 2-part question.
Well, I would definitely be, from what I've seen, I'll obviously don't need to watch the tape tomorrow, and thank God Texas is bowl eligible because I can watch again some more tape of Connor Williams coming off that meniscus and joint sprain that he had. But I think you bring in a guy like Connor Williams, especially if he measures okay, tests well. There are some questions about his actual height, his arm length especially. There are some questions there because Texas lies about all their athletic measurements or their height, weight, speed measurements. I mean, last year they said Dante Foreman was 6'3", 250 pounds, and he came to the combine and was like 6'1", 230. So we'll see about his actual size and his arm length, because he's got to hit that 33-inch cutoff to be considered tackle for me and most teams in the NFL. But you can get a guy, I think Connor Williams, if you can get him and he fills those boxes, then you definitely put him at left tackle and move Garrett Bowles over to right tackle, where I think his skill set profile is better. Garrett Bowles is more of a kick-ass. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on here. I'll say it anyway. Just definitely in the run game, he likes to whoop people up and down, especially with his athleticism and his demeanor. But he struggles technically and strength-wise in pass blocking. Last week he gave up, I want to say it was 3 hurries and 2 QB hits, and just the last few weeks he's not been playing the best at that left tackle position as far as pass rush goes. But I think you move that over to the right tackle, especially getting a more solid left tackle to play there, and you play him more of that Jack Conklin role where he's asked to get downhill and be that edge setter, especially for the downhill run game. He can work to that second level, especially peel offs with whoever the right guard is. And I think that's just a great spot for him. So especially if you can get those 2 young bookends. I mean, you see teams like Dallas, Philadelphia, the Titans. I mean, even the Rams bringing in Whitworth this season. These young quarterbacks, what their offensive line is, makes such a difference for their development and their ability just to get better and improve each game. If you have a terrible offensive line, unless you're Russell Wilson, odds are you're not going to succeed as growing as a young quarterback. So even if Paxton Lynch isn't the guy, or whatever they do in free agency, I don't see the long-term franchise guy on this roster right now, probably. But either way, you got to keep building this offensive line. And if you're picking top 5, top 10, probably not going guard. So the best option, tackle. Get a guy like Connor Williams, move Garrett Bowles over to right tackle, and your offensive line, you got the bookend set for the next 5-10 years, and you're strong going forward, especially in the AFC West with these incredible edge rushers that just are littered across this division.
Absolutely. So who is your starting quarterback? If you had to choose, who is your starting quarterback right now of everything that you've heard, of everything that you've kind of monitored or done homework on, who is your starting quarterback next year for the Broncos?
Best case scenario is Paxton Lynch.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, these next 6 games are going to be huge, and it's big for Bill Musgraves. It's big for Paxton Lynch. He could go out there. I mean, these defenses that he's playing are not great. I mean, he's playing the Jets. They're not good. Chiefs defense is not great. Raiders defense, not good. Miami, not good. So he's got a golden opportunity here. And if he puts up enough tape, they could just say, you know what? We'll see what happens. If maybe Paxton flames out next year, but they spent a first-round pick on him, and from everything I've heard, there's still a lot of fans of him in the front office, and they were kind of, I don't want to say irritated with McCoy, but McCoy was brought in to be a guy who, because of what he did with Tebow and then Manning and everything like that, he's the guy that they thought, with whatever personnel you have, this guy can build an offense and make it successful.
Mm-hmm.
Came back to Denver, and he wanted to run that 11 personnel. He wasn't being what he was brought in to be, which is a guy who can build an offense around guys that, whatever pieces you have. But now you have a guy like Musgraves coming in who, the heavy run game, play action, throwing the football down the field. Some of the best football that we ever saw from Blake Bortles was under Musgraves in Jacksonville. Carr's best season in the NFL under Musgraves. So, I mean, this is definitely a chance. He's known for not being a very complicated offensive guy. I mean, Viking fans are saying, Bronco fans get used to your team running the same 3 plays all game long. I mean, that's not the best, but for first game with Paxton, that's great. If Paxton does absolutely flame out, though, I think the Broncos are looking for a potential trade. I mean, you could see maybe a guy like Tannehill be available, which would be interesting for sure. And I definitely think that Kirk Cousins would be high on the radar. I heard that there were some Broncos front office guys that were giddy that the 49ers traded for Jimmy Garoppolo, because that means Broncos have a better chance at going after Kirk Cousins if they want to do that. So we'll see, but best case scenario, I mean, for all Bronco fans, the organization, everybody, Paxton Lynch shows enough that he can be the guy going into next season. They'll bring back a Brock, maybe use a day 2 pick on another guy to push Paxton, and maybe Chad Kelly to show something too. I'm not super. I like to tease Eric Trickle about Chad Kelly, but I don't think that's probably a likely scenario.
Well, what I was just saying for the Broncos' sake, I mean, it's always best to go with the cheapest alternative, and if the cheapest alternative sometimes is drafting another guy, or now obviously if you draft a first-round draft pick, well, you basically sealed the fate of Paxton Lynch. Obviously, But as far as, just the cheaper alternative and the best case scenario, you outlined it. Paxton Lynch is the best case scenario because I firmly still believe that Paxton Lynch is, at least in my eyes, can end up being the franchise guy. And, whether that is this offense that Bill Musgrave is going to conduct for Paxton Lynch. And everything that I've heard is that Bill Musgrave and Paxton Lynch have been two peas in a pod. They've been together, really from the start of training camp to where they are now as far as comfortability, understanding each other's strengths, understanding each other's weaknesses. They've been by each other's side for the majority of that entire season. So it's imperative that Paxton, really shows that comfortability with Bill Musgrave in this new offense that is going to end up being constructed. And, as far as Mike McCoy, I feel like he was living too much in the past. He felt like he could win games with Trevor Siemian slinging the ball around. And while that was the case against Dallas, it ended up being an admiration. And while it all got us giddy for the sake of, throwing out stuff of Trevor Siemian maybe signing a contract extension, I was one of them. I was one of them that you wanted to lock him up. Potentially now, potentially then, and I mean maybe rightfully so, but at the same time maybe we were throwing a little bit too much into it as far as the excitement train is concerned, and so now you kind of get back to reality and you start understanding, well, really the quarterback position has been coming into last season and then this season was all about unpredictability. You have no idea who that starting quarterback was going to be this season, and Trevor Siemian ended up beating him out. And so I feel that as far as the Broncos is concerned, I agree with you. The best case scenario is for Paxton Lynch to play out of control these last handful of games, and if he can maybe do what is asked of him, and that is maybe Bill Musgrave is also kind of doing an amalgamation of, we talked about it earlier as far as the run-pass option. Well, maybe they're kind of doing a mix of what the Philadelphia Eagles have done with Carson Wentz and with what they did with Cam Newton, cutting down half the field, making sure that he can, only read half the field and go based off of one read. I think that would be very beneficial for him. And we all know that he's incredibly mobile. So maybe we see some quarterback ISOs or some quarterback draws potentially with Paxton Lynch. And, for people that are starting to compare Paxton Lynch to Brock Osweiler, they are vastly, vastly different as far as mobility. Osweiler is probably a good athlete as far as maybe his mobility, but he is a very lumbering mobility versus Paxton Lynch is kind of scary at times. Like if he gets a full head of steam and he's moving at a full head of steam, he actually is incredibly mobile once he gets that full head of steam. So I think that for the Broncos, it is the best case scenario for Paxton Lynch because it does assure to you that everything that you put into it, the amount of draft capital that you traded for Paxton Lynch, it assures you that Paxton Lynch is the guy and that he can lead the team in the future and that you can actually go ahead with this offense with Bill Musgrave.
Yep, you're totally correct in that regard. It will be interesting, especially if Bill Musgrave and the offense does do well, but the Broncos struggle and Vance Joseph's fired. Do they look to bring in an offensive coach? Because that means that Musgrave's probably gone. An offensive coach is probably going to want to bring in their own guy. So definitely interesting to follow going forward. I do want to agree with you in Brock Osweiler and Paxton Lynch. While they both kind of are the same guy, just Paxton looks thicker, if that makes sense, and he runs more with a head full of steam. So he's a big, strong guy. And Cam Newton, I mean, he's not Cam Newton in terms of an athlete.
No.
Cam Newton is a freak, 6'5",
Right.
250, and just his mock draftable web is insane all across the board. But if you can play him in some of those options where you cut that field down, let him use his legs, let him use his God-given arm talent, and that could be a huge thing for the Broncos, and especially Paxton Lynch, because, like I said, those Jacksonville game last year, the Atlanta game, he didn't look so great. But that game against Tampa where he came in and was just throwing the football, playing relaxed, letting that natural God-given talent come out, that's when he's playing football, when he's out there having fun, being a goofball. And that's what I want to see these last 6 games. It's just got to go out there, have fun. If you make a mistake, learn from it. I mean, we're not going to punish you if you're throwing picks. Just go out there, get better, and make plays. So I want to see those plays where you go out there and you're like, wow, that looks like a quarterback, because we haven't seen that in Denver for a few years.
No, we haven't. And as far as his mobility, the arm, he's got the golden ticket as far as his arm is concerned. He needs to see the field, and he needs to also have a playbook that works with him. And we feel like Bill Musgrave can actually give it to him. But we touched a little bit on it briefly. It was very brief, and we have 10 minutes before we wrap it up. But if it just so happens that they decide to go in a different direction as a head coach, and maybe this is kind of a two-part idea, and I threw it out on Twitter, and it didn't get a whole lot of response. But Vance Joseph was a quarterback at the University of Colorado, but he spent his entire career as a defensive-minded coach with the San Francisco 49ers, the Cincinnati Bengals, and the Miami Dolphins. Did he spend so much time and so much ample time as a defensive-minded head coach that he forgot how to monitor the quarterback position? Because I feel like if he did that, then he would be looking at this quarterback situation differently. He would be making the necessary changes when he needed to, and potentially could that end up being his downfall?
Yeah, it definitely could be. I feel like they gave the offense more to McCoy and Musgrave, though, as regards to everything. I feel like Vance Joseph played more of a CEO role, and he definitely had a hand in making some of the decisions. But he was told he was supposed to win this year, and we saw it in preseason. I mean, I'm not at the practices, so I can't speak for that. But Trevor Siemian did play better in preseason, and this team was out there trying to win football games. And they thought, hey, if we can keep that 2015 mold with a great defense and guys around the quarterback playing well, that might be enough to get it done. But we saw pretty quickly that this team just did not have that cohesion, the leadership, or the talent on both sides of the ball to get that done. So it's a different type of season the rest of the way. And even though Trevor Siemian might, a single game right now might be the better option, although, I mean, he looks pretty rattled and fried, at least those last few games. But it's more about getting Paxton out there and letting him grow. Because like he said in the preseason, a quote that I thought was funny and kind of stuck with me, trees don't grow in the shade. So get him out there, let the light hit him, and let him grow.
Absolutely. Real quick, obviously we touched a little bit on the draft, and you touched a little bit as far as the tackle position, and we have a few more minutes before we end the show. Who are some potential targets necessarily that you see? We touched on the first round, but as far as the second round, third round, fourth round, potentially that could be some sleepers for the Denver Broncos.
Oh, excuse me, a little cough there.
That's all right.
For offensive line specifically, or just in general?
Just in general.
Just in general, well, this is a pretty darn good cornerback class. I would like to see the Broncos get in some depth there. I like both tackles for Western Michigan. They have Beal and Darius Phillips, who are a lot of fun. Alabama also has a couple really good cornerbacks. They got Averett, Brown, and Wallace. So I could see Denver looking to add another cornerback. We haven't seen much Langley. I'd like to see a little bit more of him down the stretch, but definitely something to look for there. I could see some linebacker as well. There's a game going on right now. It's probably more of a first-round talent, but I really like what I see from Tremaine Edmonds for 6'5", 250-pound linebacker for Virginia Tech. A lot of fun. I would love to bring in Josie Jewell just because he's one of my favorite Hawkeyes, and love to keep following him. Every time a Hawkeye goes to like a team like the Raiders or Patriots, I die a little bit inside, so let's not have that be a thing.
Right.
There's also a really good tight end class. I really like Christopher Herndon from Miami. A lot of fun, really talented. I like Saunders from Florida State. So it's a pretty good class. I would say the top of the class is not as talented as we've seen in year past. There's not as many blue chip kind of players. I think Connor Williams, if he measures out, that's a blue chip player. Saquon Barkley, blue chip player. Maybe those two quarterbacks, blue chip players, and those two safeties, Derwin and Minka. But other than that, you don't have many super freaky edge rushers. Like, there's no Myles Garrett in this class. There's no Marshawn Lattimore in this class. There's no super obvious left tackle. So those are normally the big guys. There's no really obvious interior defensive lineman, although I do like Hurst a lot. But it's definitely a deeper class, and Broncos have projected a lot of picks. So we'll see if they move around. I wouldn't be surprised either if they traded down and moved around, got some more ammo for 2019 as well. That's kind of the Bill Belichick mold, and John Elway has been really doing that the past few seasons as well.
Well, Nick, you are part of the HuddleUp podcast, which is also part of the Mile High Huddle. Where can they hear you as far as your podcast and and just the amount of content that you guys put out.
Yeah, we are obviously on HuddleUp Podcast. Like you said, you can find our podcast. We're on iTunes. We're on Spreaker. We're on YouTube. We put up the podcast on YouTube. So right now I'm doing 2 episodes a week. My co-host Carl Dumler and I, we do the Scout Side Preview episode every week, about an hour and a half, breaking down a lot of the matchups, especially the offensive defensive line. That you're not going to hear many people breaking down the trenches as much as we are, because we love that upfront battle. Because I mean, we hit it on all last draft season. If you're not winning up front, you're not winning football games. It's that simple. So we definitely break down a lot of that, and we're just starting back up the draft podcast as well. So we've had Eric Trickle on the last 2 weeks. We've been starting to break down some of the top quarterback prospects, because that's got to be where you start every year, right? Especially in an interesting quarterback class. So we're putting those out and we're kicking them out, and you can find that there. Also, written content on Mile High Huddle. Going to start putting out scouting reports as well. So head over heels, draft season's coming up, and going to obviously head out to the Combine again this year, and maybe Mobile, Alabama as well to cover the Senior Bowl. So it's a lot of fun, and I'm excited to get it all started. So college football season's ending, but the real fun stuff's just starting.
It really is, and I've really started to kind of grow and started really appreciate, watching the Senior Bowls and the East-West Shrine games and just bowl games in general. Bowl game, the bowl season is in essence kind of like the March Madness necessarily of the NCAA football without the, tournament of 64. But I've kind of learned to appreciate prospects and starting to get a little bit more as far as the homework is concerned, and doing a little bit more as far as the prospects and doing some mock drafts. And I liked the idea that you and I were throwing out, and having you be a part of the show, going forward, and maybe doing a live mock draft here and there of maybe whether we do a first round mock draft of going through all the 32 football teams and picking who goes where. So it's just a fascinating time, and whether it's the NFL draft, a coaching carousel, or free agency, it's just the anticipation, and really it kind of is that way for any sport, is that when you get that anticipation of a new head coach or a new player that's coming in, that anticipation kind of reaches maximum necessarily. So it is a very interesting time to follow and a very fun time to follow.
Yeah, when you have a down season, kind of like Nebraska is this year, Iowa somewhat, and definitely the Broncos, you gotta like something to look forward to, and that's the draft is. That's what this coaching carousel is, and better days got to be ahead, right? So I don't know about Nebraska Cornhuskers. Hopefully, better days for those Broncos, and I'm excited I haven't decided yet what your profile picture is going to be for Facebook yet, but I'm sure I'm going to find something fun.
Well, it isn't just Facebook; it's Twitter. We agree to that.
This is going to be great.
Yeah, because but like I said, I kind of had a feeling it was going to be bad anyway. But you gotta take the lumps every once in a while, and take one for the Husker team, even though they don't really know me.
Yeah, I think they took one today already.
Oh yeah, they've been taking one for the past few weeks. Well, hey man, it was really a pleasure to have you on, and I really do look forward to having you on in the near future.
Yeah, man, thanks for having me on. It's always good talking with you on Twitter, and good to hear your voice. It's not over an accidental Facebook Messenger call when I'm trying to talk with a patient at work. So
right.
And look forward to being on again, and hope you had a great Thanksgiving. Holiday season's coming up, and hope you enjoy the Iron Bowl and the Broncos this week as well.
Absolutely. We'll be talking here in the near future, man, and thanks again for being a part of the Cannon Parker Show.
Yep, no problem. And you can find me on Twitter at Nick Kendell, MHH. It's KENDELL.
All right. Well, hey, thanks very much, man, and we'll be having you on here in the near future.
All right, sounds good. You have a good night.
You too.
Bye.
Bye. That was Nick Kendell, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank him for stopping by to talk about the Cannon Parker Show, talk about some of the draft prospects, and talk about some of his draft insight. He is a tremendous follow, certainly on Twitter, and if you haven't already, I highly recommend you follow Nick. The amount of content that this individual puts out, you'll be hard pressed to find anyone that is very good at their job, and certainly Nick is near the top of the list, and really some of the guys at Mile High Huddle do a terrific job of putting forth great content, day in and day out. And so I ask you to check all the content over at Mile High Huddle, as well as Predominantly Orange over at Predominantly Orange, the local blogger necessarily. So thank you all to those that have listened to the Cameron Parker Show. Feel free to contribute to the Cameron Parker Show, and we'll be getting your guys' opinions on the air. If you guys feel like you guys want to tweet us, comment to the show, please do so. We are over on Spreaker and as well as iTunes and iHeartRadio, as well as YouTube. So much of the same platform that the Mile High Huddle podcast is on, we are on as well. Please go back to listen to the previous episodes of when CJ Cranock has been on, when my baseball player analyst Brooks Benson over at the Southwestern Oklahoma State University, first baseman, outfielder. You can go back to listen to that podcast. You can also go back and listen to the previous podcast that I did with Sayer Bettinger, editor and worship pastor over at the Meadows Church down over in Omaha, Nebraska. So I want to just give another quick thank you to all of those that continue to make this show possible, and thank you very much for making the Cameron Parker Show part of your guys' evening. You guys have a great night, and I will see you guys back on Tuesday with CJ Cranock, and then on Friday with another great colleague, and that is Mario Vatanze over on Twitter. You guys can also follow him as well, but I'm going to have him on as well. So thank you guys very much, and you guys have a fabulous, fabulous evening.